Hi, this is Sarah from the Old Creamery Fabrics and Quilting. We're located at 12022 New York State Route 193 in Ellisburg, New York. Our phone number is 315-846-5393. And I just want to talk to you about borders. Okay, we do a lot of long arm quilting. Greg is in charge of that, my dad. And sometimes we notice once the quilts are on the machine and they start rolling through the rollers, when we get down to the end of the quilt, sometimes things are a little off, and it has to do with the borders. So I'm going to give you 3 tips on things that you can do to improve the way you put on borders and to help square up your quilts. Okay, first thing is measure your quilt 3 different times. So on this quilt that I have on the table, I need my top and bottom border. One way to measure is, if you have a long table, you can have a long measuring tape on the table. But if you don't, you could always take a measuring tape, dressmaker's tape, and lay it out, and just make sure that you lay it in a nice straight line, like I'm following the inner border. Go through and measure here, and then measure in the middle, and then measure at the other side, and take the average of those 3 measurements, okay? Because you might find that down here you're at 58.25, and here you're 58.5, and here you're 58.5. So then you probably would want a 58.5 inch border, okay? So that's step number 1, measure 3 times. Step number 2, or trick number 2, is cut both the top and the bottom, or both sides borders at once. Sew together 3 or 4 strips. I sewed 3 together, so I have seams. I sewed 3 of them together, folded them in half, cut both of my borders at one time so that these 2 are exactly the same size. Then what I did was I folded them in half, and I pressed a seam, or not a seam, I pressed a fold right here so that I can tell that this is center, okay? So number 1, measure 3 times to figure out your length. Number 2, cut both borders at the same time. And number 3 is, when you are applying your borders, don't just put your border on here and then just start sewing, 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 and then cut off when you're done. Instead, the reason I ironed this fold in the center is that that's the center of my border, and I know that there are 6 blocks wide here, so if I count in 1, 2, 3, this seam is my center, and therefore I can line up that fold line with that center, and now I'm going to put a pin here in the center of my border. Then the next step would be to come over here to the end and match up my ends, and do it on both sides. Match up your ends, then kind of readjust the fabric, make sure it's all nice and straight. Now between the center and the end, I'm gonna put 2 pins so that I make sure that I don't accidentally, when I'm on my sewing machine, stretch this. And the same thing is true over here. Make sure that your fabrics are meeting, and then put 2, 3 pins down through here so that everything stays in place. Okay, so first off, measure 3 times and take the average to find the length of your borders. Second tip, cut 2 borders at the same time. Okay, that way you are sure that they're both the same length. And the third tip is to pin your borders. Start in the center, go to the edge, and then work your way back on both sides. Now, when you sew from one end to the other, you're guaranteed to keep the quilt square, and you won't end up with one side longer than the other. Thanks for listening.